So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin by thanking the NINDS leadership and staff for so completely committing to organizing and ensuring the success of this annual event. As a member of the planning committee, I must say that this is not a half-hearted commitment on the part of the Institute. Or the planning committee. I can tell you that planning for this event started virtually the day after last year's event. And when we have our planning committee conference calls or even face-to-face meetings, it's actually Director Story Landis and Deputy Director Walter Koroshetz and Marion Emmer and others who chair these planning committees. This is a deep commitment on the part of the Institute. And demonstrates, I think, wonderfully well what Bob Finkelstein was saying this morning about this institute is completely available to work with you and completely committed to working with you. So maybe be careful what you wish for, because please take full advantage of that. And so please join me, too, in applauding the Institute for working so hard for us. Dean.
Just real quick, on behalf of the planning committee, thanks to everybody. Your feedback is really important. We made a lot of changes based on things that we thought, but what you get back at the end of the day is really the important. So take that few minutes.
Absolutely. And we have very limited time to deal with two super important topics today. So I'm going to...
So Ron, we're going to give you a full hour.
Oh, wow. Okay, great.
You've been a good boy.
I've been good? I said the right thing to begin with? Right. Okay, that still means with six panelists, 5 minutes each would, pretty much fill the time on each topic. So I will try to be very brief in terms of the introductions. You have full bios in your packet, and please refer to them. But we've heard a little bit today about the public-private partnerships and how important they are. If you're wondering what a public-private partnership looks like, you need only look at this panel. We've got wonderful representation from industry, from government in the form of NIH and the Food and Drug Administration, and the room is full of patient advocates. So this is a public-private partnership, and let me just say a line or two about each of the panelists. It's a wonderful panel. First, Jennifer Good, my dear colleague, is co-founder and president and CEO and director of Trevi Therapeutics, a small pharma pursuing orphan drug development for conditions with unmet medical needs. How many of us in here have orphan diseases with unmet medical needs? So thank you for doing that, Jennifer. Dave Watson is an inventor and a biomedical engineer manager with over 25 years of experience in the medical device industry. Walter Koroshetz, MD, as you well know, is the Deputy Director of NINDS. Nick Kozauer of the FDA is the Medical Officer of the agency's Division of Neurology Products. Andrea Tan, his colleague, is Operations Research Analyst for the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER, where her primary focus is on development and implementation of CDER's benefit risk assessment. Finally, Michelle McMurray Heath, MD, PhD, is Associate Director for Science at the FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health. We've got two very important topics, as I mentioned. Let me, as the moderator, introduce the two topics one at a time. We'll get comments from each of the panelists and then your questions, and then move on to topic two. The first very important topic is how in the world are we ever going to cross the valley of death? We know it's got to be together. No one of us can do that alone. And I'll introduce that topic by saying that there was a time long ago in a universe far away when larger drug companies had a much fuller role in R&D. They did most of their R&D internally. And when they didn't, they turned to small biotechs and small pharmas and to academics, and they in-licensed discoveries early in the process. And at that point, the patient advocates in the room probably remember how we focused most of our attention on funding basic science. And in doing so, we turned to our colleagues here at the NIH, and especially at NINDS, and we sought larger grants, R01s and R21s and so forth, to continue to work on basic science that would lead to discovery. Because we knew once we had a discovery, there would be a pharma around to take it from bench to bedside. That economic and pharmaceutical development environment has changed drastically, as everybody in the room knows. The marketplace realities have driven those larger pharmas further and further from discovery and broadening the valley of death substantially. So it used to be a pleasant little valley where we had to focus on basic research and get a discovery. Now, patient advocacy organizations, small pharmas, and biotechs are being asked to de-risk the program. And de-risking the program means not only have we funded the basic science, but we've funded a lot of the translational science and are even preparing to, and if not already, funding some of the clinical research. At the same time, we're looking to smaller pharmas and biotechs to help get across that part of the valley, and we're continue to look to our colleagues at the NIH, but of course now we're asking them not only to help us with basic research, but to fund translational and clinical research. So it's a great challenge. And we're asking, of course, our colleagues at the Food and Drug Administration to help us get across this valley of death by giving us favorable and quick decisions, especially early in the drug development process, like at IND submission. So with that introduction, let me turn first to the two industry reps, beginning with Jennifer Good.
Good. Thank you, Ron. Oh, it's better turn on my. Thank you, Ron. So Ron mentioned I've spent basically the past 17 years as either chief financial officer or chief executive officer of small development companies. So I've been in a publicly held company, and now I've co-founded a privately held company, worked in orphan diseases in both, as well as other conditions as well. So I know what it's like to try and balance shareholders and employees with patients, et cetera. It's not always an easy equation, and it's definitely gotten harder with the access to capital. Importantly, too, I also serve on the FARA board. So I do serve on a patient advocacy board. So this day has been very useful to me to think about those issues. So I get it. This whole valley of death is a real problem. The company I've just founded, the vision is to take things from university scientists through phase 2, de-risk the program, and then sell it. And there was a lot of factors that sort of drove me to that. Some of it is I'm getting older and I want to do what I want to do and add value. But there was kind of one interesting aha moment I had, and it was actually at the first FARA board meeting I attended, where they showed all this basic research going on and all the animal models and the patient registries. And Jen Farmer stood up and said, but things seem to stop at the end of basic research and not move. We're having trouble with this piece. And it was sort of the, if you build it, they will come. So, FARA has done a fabulous job of building all the tools necessary, but then things were sort of stuck. And so I think that's where companies like mine can come in and help. And what I want to give you, I'm not a scientist. I'll leave some of the R&D challenges to my friend here, Doug, but I can help you understand the business and why this is a difficult valley to cross. And I'm going to start with explaining sort of the obvious, which is it's a terrible business model to try to go from university to the end of phase 2. You have, tons of risk in safety. You have tons of risk in efficacy. And there's only one value creation point from an investor perspective, which is the end of phase 2. So that's a reality. So you have to invest $15 to $20 million with an incredible amount of risk, and there's only one single value creation point. And by the way, you do it half blindfolded because you don't know dose, you don't know a lot of things about the trial. So having said that, I'm an eternal optimist, so I actually think we can crack this nut. But I want you to understand that's kind of the problem with the whole model. I think at the point in time, sort of the hope is once you get through phase 2 and have established, certainly safety and some good trends of efficacy, there is a lot of money out there. Venture capital has a lot of money. Industry has a lot of money, and people are dying for programs. So there is sort of an impetus to try to get across this. I really think the key is, and I've lived this successfully, is partnering with these patient advocacy groups, because we worked in my prior company to what I'm doing now in the Friedreich's ataxia area, and I think it took us 2.5 years. We went from preclinical through the end of a successful phase 2. So they recruited our trial very quickly. We accessed their physicians. Every time we had a problem, Ron knew an expert. And so basically we were able to clear roadblocks rapidly, got people motivated, and were able to move through that really quickly. So I do think you play a very key role in moving through this whole area. But there are 4 key. So I've been out, keep in mind, the last 6 months talking to venture capitalists, corporate VCs, trying to raise money for this phase of development. And I think there's 4 key elements that it's really critical have to be in place to be able to access funding to do this. And I think it's important that patient advocacy keeps this in mind. And Ron knows I bring this up at board meetings, because you do not want to be funding projects that are not going to be able to crack these 4 deliverables, because you're wasting your money, because you eventually need someone to probably pony up $50 million in the end to get your drug over the finish line. If there isn't a business case for that, there's not enough Bill Gates of the world to do that. So I just wanted to lay out on my teaching sort of what I think those 4 key elements are. First of all, there has to be an attractive market opportunity. And I think the really good news for rare disorders is there's been a really good understanding of why this is an attractive place to work in the last few years. Clearly pricing, and I know that can be a dirty word. And sometimes, I hear people in Ferris say, well, we got to make sure our patients don't get gouged. And I tell him, be careful with that, because if you found something that cured your disease, probably pricing, we could all work through that together. There's ways to get access to drugs. And I'm not saying this isn't a real issue. I just don't think it's an issue we want to be hammering on early, because somebody has to make money on this at some point or nobody invests in it. And there's a magic line that I've sort of heard from a lot of the funders in this space, that they have to perceive the ultimate market opportunity. And by the way, these people perceive these as worldwide opportunities, which is also, as you think about your diseases, you need to think about them in a global sense, because that's how drug developers will think about them, that there's sort of this line of $200 million roughly. So you do the math. If you have 1,000 patients, that's a harder nut than if you have 100,000 patients. Now, the hope here is a lot of these diseases, and Sharon referenced this in one of her comments, there's a lot of biology that crosses. So if it works in your disease, it may be interesting to look at in Parkinson's. So that can always be a hook for you. But again, below this $200 million line, it starts getting less attractive to people. But I don't want anyone to lose hope, because again, that's just one sort of data point here. It's an annual, it's top line sales, sort of annually top line sales. And again, this is global market. So when we were looking at a drug, we were looking at it for Friedreich's ataxia, but it also looked interesting in MELAS. So you can look at it across multiple diseases. The second thing is, and this is where patient advocacy can be hugely helpful, there has to be a scientific logic behind the biology of the disease and the mechanism of action of the drug. And then there have to be animal models that hopefully support that you're doing something meaningful. Because who's going to write a $15 million check if that link isn't there? And so I think, again, this is where patient advocacy can make sure they understand as much as they can about their disease, have animal models that are relevant, and be helping drug developers along the way. The third way, and this is for my FDA friends, one of the big fears of investors is, can you get clear guidance from FDA? And it's always great if someone's trodden that path ahead of you. That isn't very realistic in a lot of rare disorders. You're out there sort of paving the way. And I think from an FDA perspective, there's sort of 2 key things. One, clear communication as early as you can. And Andrea, I think you're going to maybe speak a little bit about some of the initiatives there. And then also in a timely fashion. And I'll just give you a quick example in my company, because we've been through our pre-IND meeting. We got fabulous communication in our pre-IND meeting. I opened with, look, I know you can't tell us everything we want to know, but where you can, I need you to be concise. Like the whole CYA and protect yourself is not helpful to companies trying to figure out, is this a viable path or not? And our division, which was a derm division, was incredibly helpful. The part that was frustrating as we we all know is FDA is incredibly overworked, and they have a very difficult time staying on their own timelines. So we had requested a pre-IND meeting, which you're supposed to get in 60 days. We got our notice and were granted a meeting 120 days out. We called back to say, well, that's not your guidance. And they said, well, we'll give you a meeting in 60 days, but no one will show. So, I mean, and it sounds like who cares, it's another 60 days. But when you're in a small company surviving on nothing, trying to keep investors interested, and you've made commitments on timelines, having things slip 2 or 3 months is a killer. And so I think from an FDA perspective, just keeping that in mind as well is really important. So having some kind of clear development path, and I know you all think about that too with clinical endpoints, and finally being able to protect these molecules. And again, this gets back to the pricing issue, but I think the whole regulatory exclusivity in orphan drugs is hugely helpful. The PTO patent office has become very difficult to get through in a timely manner, although they're trying as well. But those 4 elements are important: the market, the clear development path, protecting the molecule, and then having the science sort of hold together. So I just in closing want to say I think this is a really significant issue in this industry, because I think there's good science and I think there's lots of money post phase 2. I think we all need to think about how we do this in a focused way and try and address these elements together, but I do think that we can get across it. So that's the perspective of one CEO.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And now Dave Watson.
Thank you. The Valley of Death is not completely unique to pharma. We have a similar valley in the device group, but we have some stepping stones across the valley, and that's the 510K law, which allows for substantial equivalence. And a lot of devices that are on the market in the United States were proven, and they're allowed to be marketed. They're not actually approved by the FDA, but they're allowed to market through this substantial equivalence law. So if a company can demonstrate that it's similar to something that's already on the market, then it's an easier regulatory path, much easier regulatory path. But the similarities between the device industry and the pharma is that the big companies are not iterating anymore. They as well have given up a lot of their R&D and are now just marketing the devices that they have that are stable and producing profits. So smaller companies now are establishing these setups. The startup companies now have the burden of coming up with the innovations. So the dilemma there is the companies that have the existing technology aren't iterating it. The small companies don't have access to it because of patents and things like that, but they're the ones that really want to invest their efforts in these fields of work. And so the small companies really need to be more innovative, or they need to find their way around these patents and show to the FDA that they're substantially equivalent to the other things. And they will get these products to a certain point where then the big companies just buy them up and then take it from there, or shelf it if they don't want to compete with it. So the dilemma is iteration is the key to device development, and yet the big companies aren't doing it. So what can you as patient advocates do to ensure that if you're in a field that has a device analog, and I know a lot of ailments in this group are purely pharmaceutical, but the things that you can do are pressure these big companies that are making the profits on their existing stuff in your field of work to get back to the R&D board and do this stuff instead of just taking the profits and supporting these other divisions that are losing money. Or you can find these small companies that want to iterate in your field of work and find ways to support them. So I have more to talk about in the second group, but the Valley of Death is there for the devices as well. And if it is something brand spanking new and revolutionary, the U.S. device law is almost as cumbersome to get those things approved as it is to get a new drug. But this 510K law is really a nice thing.
And now thank you very much, Dave, and now to Dr. Walter Koroshetz.
Great. So it's all up here. Just to make a couple of points. The first one, the picture up there, it says Life in the Valley of Death. It's actually the name of a book. It's an oxymoron. The thing to know is life in the Valley of Death is very short. And so somewhat facetiously, but then it has a serious side to it, and that is if you go into the Valley of Death, your product can die, but your entire field can also die. So you also, oftentimes people are so tagged to a certain product and trying to get it out, or trying to do something, even if, just for the sake of doing something. And I would just argue that if you try that and you die in the valley, that there is significant repercussions that will affect your ability to try and do this again. Certain lots of fields, the stroke field being one of them, entire decimation after $1 billion or so lost in trying to get stroke therapies. You cannot get a company interested in stroke, even though it's the fourth most common cause of death. So that's the first point. So if you go in, you really want to go in to get out as fast as you can, and you want to go in with all the possible ammunition you can. So the first thing is you want to pick a good horse. You're going into this valley of death. You got to make it across. You need to pick a good horse. Now, I guess the point to make is that there are a lot of bad horses out there that people are trying to sell. Maybe not because they're trying to con anybody, but they are attached to a certain therapy, and they will push their therapy, and if you're not careful, it's easy to buy into that and to pick a bad horse. And our institute has put a lot of effort most recently into really trying to examine the preclinical data that goes behind a therapy going into something that's expensive, a translational project or a clinical project. And the sad thing is that there's a lot of stuff out there that cannot be replicated very easily, that the findings they may be replicated in one lab, but if you change conditions, they're not replicated. The robustness of the effect can be quite small if you start changing things. And that's very dangerous, because when you go into patients, lots of things are changing. If you don't have something with a real robust effect, your chances of coming out with a good result at the end are very low. So you really want to do that, and you want to, as best you can, get an unbiased team that's experienced in translational research. Not many, but there are some organizations that have people who are just incredibly dedicated to the disease, and it's very hard for them to see objectively what the risks are going into this kind of a business. So you always want to balance people who have their own biases. We all have our own biases. You want to balance that as best you can so you get objective information before investing large amounts of money into this area. And the next thing I think was brought out already is that usually you're taking a product that has some evidence base. That evidence base is often in animal studies, and the valley of death has been going from the animal to the human. That's where the death occurs. And there may be many reasons for this. It may be, as we mentioned, the animal studies really weren't very good quality to begin with. Then you're dead on arrival. It could be that the animal studies were good, but there's something wrong when you go to the human. And the things that can be wrong are, as you mentioned, you said you go in blindfolded in terms of dose and duration. That could be the end. It could be that you have a really good therapy, but you don't actually know how to test it. So before going in, you really want to bridge this gap between the animal and the human, knowing, if you can, that the drug or whatever the therapy you're promoting is actually having the effect in the human that you expected from your animal studies. And that's what I consider the general realm of biomarkers, to try and allow you to do that in some fashion. Otherwise, you're going in blind. And I think that the evidence, at least that in neuro diseases, if you go in blind, you're not going to have a success. You really do have to go in knowing all these criteria. Are there gender effects of the drug? What's the dose? What's the duration? What's the population that you need to study? If you pick a population, it's the right disease, but they're too late in their disease stage, and the drug just is not going to work. You're going to come up with a negative trial. You're not going to know if your drug really did anything, and it could really close the door on any future trials for 10 more years. So I think you want to really have these things kind of set. And then the other one, which is somewhat similar, is that is particularly when you start to deal with venture capital companies or large pharma. As was mentioned, their job is to return on investment to the people who gave them the money. So they're the stewards of the money, whether it's the stockholders or the investors. And so there's a real eye on the ball, which is developing profit for the company and the innovators. And so, as you can imagine, the natural tendency is to try and make a big jump so you can grab on to the profit and the benefit. And in general, what that has meant is that companies take shortcuts to get to the big market. Instead of going step by step, their marketing people will influence their scientists to say, oh, this will all work out. Let's just test it in all comers. And that has, I think, also been the death of many therapies. That you have to show a benefit in sometimes you have to show benefit in a very small group of patients first, then you have a foot in the door, you have something to rely on, and then you can start widening that door. If you try and go through the whole door at once, you may actually miss that crevice and not come up with success. So I would say try and avoid this mirage of jumping to the cure too quickly. Try to just make sure if you can in the earliest. Basically think about it as this is a war. It's you have to go in with all ammunition. You can't have one hand tied behind your back, and you don't kind of invade all of Europe at once. You basically go to Normandy, put everybody you can on the beach. You didn't see all those boats and everything going over to this one little spot for no good reason. The idea is you get a beachfront, know you have something, and then work out from there. And I think that's what you have to do in this world, because it is very difficult. And this valley of death, not only does it kill your single project, but as I said before, the most dangerous thing is often the ramifications it has for the future. So those would be my comments. And if you just remember the pictures, you'll...
And along with the picture, I guess we could say that we should all pick really good horses to get across the valley, but we have to take care that we don't get a real cowboy in the saddle that tries to take all the shortcuts. And
That's the unbiased knowledge of translation.
Yeah, there you go. And thank you very much, Walter. And now for Dr. Nick Kozauer of the Food and Drug Administration.
Well, thank you very much. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep my introductory comments for this first topic relatively short. What I wanted to mainly touch on is that the review division has several mechanisms that we can rely on to help try and facilitate drug development for diseases that are serious and or life-threatening. And so, as people may be aware, the mechanisms that have been in place up until now have primarily been the Fast Track designation for development program, priority review status for development program, and accelerated approval. But the one I wanted to mention in particular was under the recent enacted legislation, the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, or FDAJA, there was an additional categorization created referred to as a breakthrough therapy. And what essentially that means for people that are familiar with Fast Track, it's sort of like Fast Track Plus. So it's for therapies that are for serious and life-threatening and/or life-threatening conditions that have some promising early clinical data. The FDA will make a commitment to work with the sponsors of those compounds to actually help in the development of the additional clinical trials that will support potentially an approval. And so the focus really is to help expedite and streamline the development process for those drugs to really get them to market as quickly as possible. So it's something that I think holds a lot of promise as an additional tool, really above and beyond what we have so far. It's worth mentioning that the nuts and bolts of how this will be operationalized are still being worked out, but there is a draft guidance that's being written that will be more specific and flesh that out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. And next is Andrea Tan of the Food and Drug Administration.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. And first, I'd like to say thanks to NINDS for extending the invite to FDA and joining this panel and this wonderful workshop. I'll also keep my comments short in the essence of time, but to address this topic from the perspective of communication, I'd like to highlight also a few other commitments in FDAJA, the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, that have been signed into law with the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, or PDUFA, one of which is a commitment to developing a dedicated team of liaisons between FDA FDA and sponsors during drug development. And this team will serve as a point of contact for sponsors that need general questions answered or clarification questions answered. And will also be a second point of contact for sponsors if a sponsor is having trouble contacting a review team within FDA. And second, a very important program that is part of PDUFA 5 is the program for enhanced transparency and communication that will apply to new molecular entity, new drug applications, and original biologics license applications that are submitted after October 1st. And this program involves several new avenues of communication between FDA and sponsors during review, which takes place in a pre-submission meeting at mid-cycle and at the end of the cycle. So this commitment came out of direct feedback that we heard from industry that they want to hear more and get more status updates of what how a review is going when an application is going through that review. And I'll just close for now and save the rest of my comments for the benefit risk topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And now Michelle McMurray Heath, also from the FDA.
One says Fidasia, one says Fidaja, tomato. We're total alphabet soup, as you know, in the federal government in general, but particularly with our user fee laws. And if anyone got lost in that, Fidasia is basically what I like to call the Uber UFA, because it's our pan user fee law. So it included the next version of PDUFA for drugs and also our MEDUFA for medical devices. Now, just in general, now if that's not enough to confuse everyone, just remember the song, and that's all you need to know. I think it's really important, not just in my time at FDA, but prior to that when I was working with a lot of patient groups in the think tank world, for patients to think as globally as possible. Whoa! Someone was celebrating with champagne over here, the passage of the law. Exactly. When we think about the Valley of Death, we often think of one drug or one medical intervention getting to an individual patient, when what we really need to be thinking about is an armament. We need a collection of medical interventions that together are going to move any patient or a whole patient population with a range of presentations and a range of stages at which they find themselves in the disease to an improved quality of life. So that's really the valley that we need to cross, and that's a lot more complicated than getting one drug to market. And to add a wrinkle to that is most patients, I find, at least in my communications with patient groups, don't realize the impact that the medical device space has on their quality of life and their clinical options. So our center director, Jeff Shuren, likes to say you can go to a physician and never get a prescription for a drug, but you have to interact with a medical device. You have your blood pressure measured, you have your EKG taken, you have laboratory diagnostic tests drawn. All of those are regulated by the Center for Devices. And at the other end of the spectrum, from the most routine medical interactions to the most dramatic interventional interactions, are also medical devices. All your surgical interactions, your MRIs, your medical implants, most of those are medical devices regulated by the Center for Devices. So it's an important space to keep your eye on. I know there's a lot of emphasis on drugs, as there should be, and that's an important space to watch as well. But the medical device world also has some unique clinical options for you. Now, that being said, it's been a space that's been hit even harder, I think, by the recession than the pharmaceutical industry, because unlike pharma, the medical device space, as was mentioned earlier, contains a lot of small companies and mom and pop shops. You can imagine building a new catheter in your garage, or usually a surgeon in their lab, with just a few people, but you can't imagine creating a new pill just in a very, very small space with a few hands. You need a big enterprise to undertake that. So that means that there's a lot of room for creativity, a lot of openness to new players, which is great for innovation in our space, but it also means they're very, very vulnerable to having reduced investment options. So we as a center feel that that's very important for us to address, and we do everything we can to do that. Now, so what new options have we laid on the table to try to help with that valley of death in at least the medical device space? One very important approach that we've taken is called our Innovation Initiative. And this is a process that we have we're doing this in a space-by-space basis. So we started with end-stage renal disease, for example, but we're looking at limited clinical indications, and we're going out into those indications and putting out basically requests for proposals. Do you have new innovative solutions that are just ideas or concepts at this point, but you want really early interaction and partnership with the FDA so you can decide early on how you need to approach your innovative idea so that you can get clearance or approval of your product as soon as possible. So we're really working hand in hand with these innovators from a very early stage, and so far it's worked very, very well. We're just about to launch a new clinical area in October. So keep an eye peeled for that because there will be many more of those to come. The other thing we've started is what we call parallel review with CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And this is to say, as you come to FDA to get your device cleared or approved, you should also be starting the clock with CMS so that you can also get payment for that device underway as well, so that you're not completing one clock, the FDA approval clock, and then having to start a whole second clock to get coverage decisions out of CMS. You can start both clocks at the same time so that your solution can get to patients faster. So we think these are some important approaches, but I also think that the benefit-risk conversation is very important for innovation as well, and I know we'll get to that in the next round.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And I think Dave Watson has some comments to add. Yeah. I see you left your chair. So.
Yeah, it's not necessarily leaving my chair, but Dr. Kirschauer said a couple things that touched on what I alluded to, but it also hit a raw nerve in some. He said one thing that really got me was we can't get companies to get into stroke. Well, I've spent the last 8 years specifically in stroke. And there is a lot of medical device iteration going on in stroke right now. The problem, you guys might not realize it, is because it's all happening in Europe, which goes to what I'm going to be talking about in the next half session. But there are 3 devices now approved for acute stroke in the United States. There are more than 7 approved in Europe, all from the that are built in the United States, approved there, and have been approved years before they were allowed here. But the other thing was that we have to show efficacy in a small group before we can move on to the big group. That is a U.S. issue. In Europe, physicians are not as constrained either by their medical device practitioners or by any government agencies to use things off-label. So if a drug is approved there for a particular indication and yet somebody has found that it's efficacious for other things, either by the side effects like Viagra, or other examples, they're pretty much free to use that. This is a U.S. regulation that really encumbers our physicians for practicing outside exactly labeled indications. And that brings me to the other thing. He brought up the example of invading Europe. Well, that is exactly what's happening in the medical device industry and in the pharmaceutical industry, I think, is we have to invade Europe first because the approval laws there are more streamlined and they're more predictable in Europe than they are here. And that is really, the valley of death is getting wider and wider in the United States in the 27 years I've practiced in this industry, whereas there it's pretty much stable, it's predictable, and you get into a known situation there, where here it's a lot of going back and forth. If it takes you 10 years to get a drug to market, that bar may have raised so much in that 10 years that your starting point and your ending point are very different.
So what are your questions for this marvelous panel to help you get across?
I'm learning the Valley of Death is getting everybody to agree to IRBs, but that's another topic. But can you address, it seemed like there was an awful lot of conversation toward the middle of last year on surrogate endpoints, and I'm wondering if there's been any movement with the FDA on establishing or accepting surrogate endpoints?
Sure. Well, I can answer that, I guess, in a general manner. So Yes, there is. There is a formal process for a biomarker qualification that is run through the Office of Translational Science that is set up to work outside of the context of specific INDs, where specific drug development tools like surrogate endpoints can be discussed, and we can work with the developers to help facilitate the qualification of those endpoints. And also with FIDASIA or FIDASIA or whatever we're going to call it, it was also the under accelerated approval. The thinking had primarily been that accelerated approval, you could approve a drug based on a surrogate that was primarily either a physical marker or some sort of lab test. FIDASIA clarified that intermediate clinical endpoints as well can serve as surrogates. And so if you have an intermediate clinical endpoint that patients may or may not care so much about the outcome on that measure, but if that measure can reliably predict what you do care about, which is generally irreversible morbidity or mortality, we also now have the ability to use accelerated approval to apply to a clinical endpoint as well.
The other thing, if you want to make a comment or question, is to go to the microphone.
Sorry. Robert McBurney Accelerated Cure Project for MS. I'd be interested to hear for those organizations that are developing things for rare diseases about the mixing of funding and how say, for example, if you don't have enough money from any source, how comfortable the mixing of donor money, pharma money, and federal money might be. And I raise this because I recently had a conversation with a policy consultant about PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, in which a project is very large. There's a patient-centered outcome part of it, but there's also a part that pharma might fund. And this person who'd previously been a health policy person in the Clinton administration and now is a consultant in Washington said, be wary of mixing for-profit and federal money in the funding of anything. But sometimes that's the only way that things are going to be fully funded. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so I've thought a lot about financial strategy, and to be honest, the simple answer is cost of capital. I mean, government money is always free to some extent, and I mean, just to make this sort of give you my own example, right now I founded a company I own half, so anytime I can get free money and advance that, I'm hugely motivated. Having said that, I can't get enough and I can't move fast enough, and so that's where the partnerships with, venture capital. I gave away 2 children. I mean, thank God I have 3, but they have a lot of money and you can move quickly, and oh, by the way, if you have success, they can pony up another 20 million in overnight. Pharma's great because they bring a different set of things to the equation. They bring in expertise, and so sometimes you throw corporate venture into the equation just to get access to their resources. And then I've talked about patient advocacy. Again, I don't know, at least on the scale I've dealt with, they can really fund a lot of this big clinical stuff, but they bring so many other resources. So I would actually say it's advantageous to have a blend, but really at the end of the day, it's about being able to achieve your objectives in a timely manner, but being mindful of cost of capital, because money can be very expensive. But no, I would not say it's complicated to mix funding sources.
I think also from the NIH standpoint, we frequently do trials that have mixed funding from industry and federal. So NeuroNext was put together particularly to allow a legal pathway for industry to bring in therapies to be tested in NeuroNext.
And any number of U mechanisms have used a combination of NIH funding and pharma activity and patient advocacy activity. So are there any other pressing questions on this first topic before we move on to topic number 2? Seeing none, let me say a little bit in introduction of topic number 2 is, as you see on your sheet, risk-benefit analysis. And as most of you know, that analysis and the decisions that accrue to that analysis don't begin and end at market approval. They begin right at IND submission and lead to the decisions of go, no go, or clinical hold, or go proceed on phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. And to just set the stage for the discussion by the panel and then you, I'd like to refer to a paraphrase of what I'll try to get as accurately as possible of what Janet Woodcock, the CEDAR director, said at a forum that many of you here in the room were in attendance at, the May 18th meeting on this very topic, risk-benefit evaluation. And she was one of the first speakers, and she led with the notion of, as I'll try to quote her as closely as possible, I would love to be able to tell you, she said, that benefit risk evaluation is purely the product of data analysis, that all we do is collect all the data, add up the numbers, do the math, and we've got our decision. She said, I'd love to be able to tell you that, but it just wouldn't be true. At the end of the day, benefit risk evaluation is based on a value judgment. And I thought that was, terribly honest and compelling of her to say. And I'll combine with that a statement many of you in the room have heard, if not all of you, and that is that value judgment and the risk-benefit analysis is on a sliding scale of risk tolerance. Let's say at the left end is a cancer patient with 6 months to live. And for that patient, I've heard FDA reviewers and review division chiefs say, we're willing to take a 50-50 risk. This therapy might have a 50% chance of killing you and a 50% chance of benefiting you. We're willing to take that with a cancer patient with 6 months to live. On the other end of this sliding scale would be chronic, less severe conditions. And in those conditions, these same people would say, we're going to be very cautious. You've probably heard other people put the endpoints of the spectrum at cancer with 6 months to live at one end and migraine headaches at the other. Well, I think I could report soundly from every patient advocate in the room of a neurological condition that we want two things in this regard. We want to see neurological and neurodegenerative diseases placed on that sliding scale somewhat closer to the cancer patient with 6 months to live rather than the migraine headache. And that's so for a couple of reasons. One is that our patients may or may not have longer than 6 months to live. But when they get to that 6 month point, their quality of life will have decades earlier been so deeply compromised that they will not have the quality of life that cancer patient will have up to the 6 months prior to death. Furthermore, for most neurodegenerative diseases, the insult neurologically occurs so early in life that even before symptoms onset, you've got a lot of the damage done, if not most of the damage done. So if we can't, in the regulatory process, tolerate some risk early for these patients, the risk tolerance becomes irrelevant. So with that, and the second thing we want is, and I hope I'm speaking for everyone, is we want to see patient representation at each of those stages of clinical development so that the FDA reviewer is not left in the woods wondering what this condition really is and how much benefit the patient population is expecting to potentially derive from this therapeutic, and how much risk that patient population is willing not only to take but embrace to get there. So with those, introductions down, let me turn to maybe we'll turn first to our FDA colleagues. Nick Kozauer first.
Well, Thank you very much again. So, I think the fundamental question, or one fundamental question in the context of a meeting like this, is how do we as reviewers in division integrate input from patients and from caregivers and from advocates into making our risk-benefit assessments? And admittedly, that is not a very well formalized process at this point until you get to the late stages of drug development. So if an NDA has been submitted and there's an advisory committee meeting, there are patient representatives on the advisory committee. There is an open public forum as part of that advisory committee meeting, but that doesn't really address the earlier stages that Ron was referring to in drug development. But that is changing to some degree with the new legislation that was passed. I'm going to let Andrea talk to the specifics of that in a little bit more detail because she has been more involved with that. But when I mentioned, as from a personal perspective, I continue to see patients. I see patients in a memory clinic, and with having a psychiatry background, I treat them not only for their cognitive part of their disorder, but also for the behavioral aspects of their condition, which, as people may know, are often the most distressing to patients. And families. And so for me, that goes a long way in keeping me grounded and very acutely aware of how devastating these conditions are. And I feel comfortable in saying that the leadership in our division has a sensitivity to the seriousness of many of the diseases that fall under our purview. But ultimately, it does come back to the point that a key component of the risk-benefit equation lies in the seriousness of the disease that is being evaluated. And that, as Ron mentioned, by definition is a value judgment. And I would say not only the relative seriousness of the disease itself, but also within a disease, what are the endpoints or what are the targets of treatment that mean the most to patients? I think we need to keep that in mind as well. So as a general statement, I'm a reviewer primarily for dementia drugs in the division. If we had a drug that we thought was an effective treatment for, say, Alzheimer's disease or frontotemporal dementia, I don't think there's any question we'd be willing to approve that drug with a higher tolerance of risk. Realizing that additionally there are now mechanisms post-approval to continue to monitor that risk and to mitigate some of that risk through REMS, et cetera. But it's not only the approval stage. I think we would tolerate a higher level of risk in a novel drug for a neurodegenerative condition in earlier phase studies as well versus, say, a treatment for migraine that has a similar risk-benefit profile potentially to 3 other drugs that are also approved. But it gets back again to the question of how do we as reviewers inform our value judgment? And I think we do that in several ways currently. One is that we do lean on our own clinical experience. 2 is we try to take part in meetings and discussions in the disease communities when we're invited, and we really do try to respond to those as many as we can. And then for those of us that see patients, again, to me, that does certainly affect how I conduct my review work as well. So all of that said, there's no question that we can all benefit from a greater formalization of the interaction, especially in earlier stages as well. And that's something I'll pass the torch to Andrea, who can talk to that in a little bit more detail about how that might change. Thank you.
So before I talk about this idea of a more systematic gathering of patient input on condition, I'll back up a little bit and talk about CEDAR's benefit risk assessment framework that has been in development since 2009. And it's a framework that seeks to serve 2 purposes. One, to internally standardize our thinking on benefit risk and help draw out the key benefit risk considerations that take place during review. And to 2, externally provide a clear and concise summary of communicating those key benefit risk considerations. And this benefit risk framework lays out 5 key decision factors that explicitly call out the clinical context that a decision is made in, which includes the analysis of the condition, so how severe is a condition, what subpopulations are identified, does the condition severity change over time, those such questions. And also an analysis of unmet medical needs, so what is the current treatment armamentarium and how satisfactory is it? And this framework, and of course, following decision factors include the clinical benefit and risk that is seen in the clinical trials and any risk management that can take place to mitigate those risks. And I'd like to point out that the benefit risk framework also makes explicit the different kinds of information that are considered when performing a benefit risk assessment. So not only are those key facts, evidence, and information from trials considered, but also the conclusions and the implications for decision take a huge part in the regulatory decision making. So the framework helps to draw out these two key types of input and makes explicit those the clinical judgment that needs to take place to draw conclusions from the evidence that you see in the trials. So this framework is currently being piloted in the Office of New Drugs and will be implemented with PDUFA over the next 5 years. And to speak to the idea of gathering more systematic patient input, there's also a commitment in PDUFA 5 that seeks to obtain a better understanding of the patient perspective on those top 2 rows of the benefit risk framework, and that's the clinical context, the unmet analysis of condition, and the unmet medical need. We recognize there are currently few venues where we systematically gather this type of input from patients, and that the review process can benefit from hearing this kind of information. Some key questions that we hope to address include what aspects of the disease are most important to you, or are there aspects of your disease that aren't currently captured in clinical trials? And these kinds of discussions, we think, can help inform drug development through providing this information to reviewers throughout the life cycle and throughout drug development, and also help inform development of drug development tools such as biomarkers or patient-reported outcomes. So we also recognize that there's going to be lots of interest in this particular initiative, and in PDUFA 5, we've committed to 20 meetings, each focused on a specific disease area. Of course, we recognize, there's more than 20 diseases out there, so we're also going to be developing a roadmap to help set out a set of best practices for other groups to pursue and convene similar types of meetings to provide meeting reportouts with a similar kind of information. So we'll be kicking off this patient-focused drug development effort in actually the next 2 months. So stay tuned for a Federal Register notice on a public meeting that's just discussing the general points of this initiative.
So you've heard thus far from the Center for Drugs on their benefit risk approach, and the Center for Devices has taken a slightly different approach. Earlier this spring, we released our draft benefit risk guidance, and this is actually the first time FDA has really told a group of reviewers, and we've done this very systematically in the Center for Devices, okay, you are allowed to consider data submitted by sponsors that purports to measure patients' views on risk tolerance for a certain medical intervention. So let's say you're trying to submit an application for a new medical device to treat coronary artery disease, and the sponsor has also conducted a study that shows that 75% of the patients are willing to accept the perhaps 25% risk of morbidity or mortality in order to get the proposed benefit of this intervention. So reviewers are now directed to accept that data, look at that data, and weigh it in the pro-con equation as to whether or not that device should be approved or cleared. So it's a very directive, proactive approach that we've taken, but we know that there's a lot more to do. And in order to encompass that a lot more to do, we've also started the Patient Preference Project, which is going to come up with a kind of collection of approaches that will allow both sponsors to more systematically take those measurements of patient preference and allow our folks internally, one, to continue to research how best to measure patient preference, and then also to use web-based tools to take very rapid but perhaps a little less robust in terms of its analytical validity measurements of what patients are feeling and wanting and desiring in the medical intervention space, so we can perhaps share that information with sponsors so that they know, okay, this is an area where there are few other interventions available. Patients are very much in support of new interventions coming on the market, and they are willing willing in this instance to accept a greater risk tolerance than they may otherwise accept, so that sponsors can use that to approach investors to consider their own research portfolios and then to choose which areas to pursue. So we're taking a very combined approach in this regard, and we think it's very, very important. I was struck by what Ron said when he said, well, most patients with neurological diseases wish that they were considered more on the cancer patient with 6 months to live end of the spectrum rather than the patient with migraine headaches. And I would say that actually, as we've delved into this topic more and more, we found it's a little more complicated than that, because a patient with the same diagnosis but at a different stage of the illness or with a different presentation might have a very different risk tolerance than someone who is very severely affected. So one of the things that we've really grappled with as we've tried to take this more into account is how do we represent that range of patient views on risk tolerance. And I must say, Amy Comstock-Rick, Rick is sitting right down here in front and who was on the earlier panel, has been instrumental in shaping our thinking on this. I think in part because of the spectrum of presentations of Parkinson's, but also just as a leader in this whole benefit risk conversation among so many people in town. And I think her message has been heard loud and clear. I think it was evident in what showed up in PDUFA. It's definitely evident in what showed up in MEDUFA and in our guidance that came out earlier this year. So we thank her and the other patient groups in the audience for their leadership on this issue. I did want to revisit something that was mentioned earlier when it said that, well, for medical devices space, you must really go to Europe because things are approved so much faster there and things are much more predictable. I would beg to differ a little bit on that. One, in that even though studies that have come out recently have shown that, yes, in some cases, medical devices come to the market sooner in Europe, that's often because the bar for approval there is showing safety but not necessarily efficacy. And most patients that we come into contact with want to know that a medical intervention is actually going to do what it says it's going to do and not just not harm them. So we think that that's a very important part of our approval to retain. And it's why the FDA medical device approval process is still the world's gold standard. The other thing that we found recently is some of the things that got to market sooner in Europe actually ended up being recalled. And you saw that with the breast implant story that came out earlier this spring. And so it shows that there's still some validity in having a little bit of a variety in the level of evidence that the different global leaders accept. The other thing that I would just point out is that we are working very hard to make sure that we work not just with approval, but also with coverage decisions. And what a lot of European patients find is that while their medical device may be approved, the coverage decision that's made by the national healthcare systems often takes another 1 or 2 years. So you can have a device that's on the market, but no way to pay for it. And that's something that's much rarer in the case here. So we think that's very important. And there's just finally, I would say that our center director, Jeff Shuren, is a neurologist by training. And so this whole space is incredibly important to him. And he's very, very dedicated to finding solutions. And he understands all of the complexities and the nuances of trying to address the needs of patients with neurological disorders. So it's something we're very committed to as a center.
Wonderful comments from our FDA colleagues. Thank you very much. Anybody else on the panel want to add anything at this juncture? Walter?
No, I just say, having worked with the FDA on a number of instances, there's lots of complicated issues that have to be sorted out before they can make decisions. I think on the Institute side, we're very happy to get into those discussions. We have regular meetings with the CBER Biologics Group under an MOU, and we sit and talk, confidentiality being covered, and we really look forward to doing that with the other groups as well, if there's interest. Yeah.
And Dave Watson has something else.
Yeah, I applaud the new guidelines. I think that is taking a step forward. But you touched on something that is the fundamental difference between European approval and U.S. approval, is that here the government is expected to make decisions on behalf of the people. And the people are not homogenous. There are the people that would risk their lives instantly for that 1% chance of getting rid of their disease, and then there are the other people at the other end of the spectrum. And the way to solve that problem is to actually let the people decide. And if the doctors had these treatments up front and they were able to disclose to their patients appropriately what their individual risk is, then the individual person gets to make that choice. The United States is extremely risk adverse. That's not the FDA's fault. That's the situation they're dealing with. You know, you turn your TV on, every night there's some patient advocacy group that's not in this room that's chasing ambulances saying, did you take drug X for depression? And have you ever had depression, felt suicidal, or had a headache? That's my point. Well, that's my point. Let me finish the point. That Europe does not tolerate that. They would never think of suing their doctor if a drug went wrong or a procedure went wrong. It just doesn't happen. But here, that's the golden way home. You know, you get a bad procedure, you get to sue for $2 million. You're off. You know, you don't have to work for the rest of your life. It's a societal issue that you patient advocacy groups can work against, because you've got these other patient advocacy groups representing some of your own patients suing when you're trying to get stuff to happen. It's a measure of us as a society. You know, we're allowed to do the most ridiculous things in the spirit of sport or recreation. You know, if you look at my bio, I'm a stunt pilot. So.
We're talking about risk here, or what?
We're talking about risk benefit, but you know, if I had one of these debilitating diseases, I couldn't participate in these trials until the government told me I could. You know, where's the sense in those two choices? So, this is not the FDA's issue. This is not. Collectively, this is a U.S. issue, and I tell you, as a head of R&D for the last 20 years, I have spent a lot of my time in Europe because of these two issues. They're much more risk tolerant, and it is easier to get devices approved there because efficacy is borne out in the marketplace, not in the trials there. So yes, you have a lower burden of efficacy there, but when something goes wrong, it goes wrong quickly, and those products are gone, just as with as little risk to the people as if you had a bigger trial here and held that product back. So. Breast implants, a great story. Breast implants were 510K approved 27 years ago. They were the easy path, okay? And we had a big debacle in the United States about it. So that's not part of their regulatory issue. That's part of happens, okay?
Okay.
So,
Okay.
one last point.
Okay.
So, about 16 years ago, I had the privilege and yet the pain of working at a company in biotech that was taking genetically engineered cells, encapsulating them in a membrane, and putting them in human beings. And we got into phase 2 trials that we had to conduct in Europe, and we had to conduct that trial in terminal cancer pain patients because of this risk-benefit thing. So our indication had to be pain, and we were taking cow cells, taken right from the chromaffin cells, right out of the adrenal glands of cows, harvested here in the United States, taking them to Europe and putting them in patients during the height of mad cow disease. But what we proved is that we could keep mammalian cells alive in human beings for up to a year and a half, which is the longest any of these patients survived. They were still producing these catecholamines, and no, it wasn't efficacious because it was a pain trial conducted in Czech Republic, where these patients would have been sent home with their cancer with a bottle of aspirin and say, you're on your own. Where they got into our trial, they got weekly treatments, they got to, see their doctor and do their pain scores, and everybody got better, so there was no statistical benefit. The whole program, after $93 million worth of development, was shut down because that pain trial killed the whole technology. In R&D, we had molecules for ALS, we had them for Parkinson's, we had, and we had proven to cure blindness in an established bunny model. All this technology was shelved because of this push towards having to show or to be able to use humans in experiments where maybe that technology or that indication is not really the most appropriate place to go first.
And last word for Jen Good.
I talked so much on the last topic. I only have 2 small comments, but I'm sympathetic to this whole wrestling around with risk. I think FDA does, because you probably know, but as a CEO, you have personal liability, as does our chief medical officer. And I would only make 2 observations of, 2 areas in orphan drug development I find myself squirming hard on. And it's funny getting to know Ron and his crowd. I feel like they're more aggressive about, we'll accept risk than the CMO and I are. We're always kind of squirming away. And there's sort of 2 primary reasons. One, in orphan drug development, you're not putting your drug in that many people. I worked on a pain development program where it was in thousands of people. So you see a lot of safety data. I had only seen it in roughly 30 people by the time you start making safety decisions. And so that is a very tough decision. The other place where you get forced your hand early on this risk is compassionate use, because if you get any kind of signal, of course, your patients want access. Well, as a CEO sitting there knowing you've got certain safety issues you need to characterize better, you've seen an efficacy signal, it's a really hard decision to put yourself into. So patients, I know, want access, but you have to remember, we don't want to kill anybody, and we want to properly characterize the doses of our drug. And that compassionate use issue, it's important, but as a CEO, it's a really hard one to go to sleep with at night, because you really haven't seen that much data. So those are my 2 comments in this space on risk, as, again, the perception of a CEO, but it's tricky.
All these comments are just absolutely excellent, and this discussion could go on the rest of the day and into tomorrow, in my view. But so what are your immediate, most pressing questions or comments? Feel free to make either.
Amy?
Yeah.
My question is for Nick, although others may have a comment.
My question is for Nick, although others may have a comment. One of the concerns that I have heard from industry colleagues is that when something's going to CDER, one way to mitigate the risk is FDA or CDER may push the population that's tested in the trial to more advanced stages of the disease, and that the sponsors may be concerned that you're less likely to see clinical benefit because you're giving whatever the therapy is to people in advanced stages, so trial fails, when in fact, if you had been able, if they had pushed for earlier stage disease, you might have actually had something there. And so that's the reverse way of mitigating the risk, but is of great concern, I think, to the community.
Well, that's an excellent point. I am most able to speak to the drug development in dementia, in the dementia field, but that point is very, very topical in dementia, because we're very much seeing that this whole push in Alzheimer's disease to target amyloid is not working in patients with symptomatic disease. And so the field is very much rethinking, does it mean that the theory is wrong, or does it mean that we just need to go earlier? And so this is something we're very closely involved with the Alzheimer's field. Is there are 2 groups that people have been talking about. One is this so-called prodromal Alzheimer's disease, where people have some early memory loss, but have a biomarker that might be consistent with Alzheimer's, so an amyloid scan that's positive, or a CSF test that's positive. But then that line goes earlier into what you can call preclinical Alzheimer's disease, where people that are normal elderly but have amyloid in their brain. And this is something that's being talked about as being a target for treatment. So I think we're certainly supportive of those efforts. And again, we've been involved in those conversations very closely, but it is a significant challenge in how to define the patients that you're going to go into, because how you define them, it's going to very much affect how much risk you're willing to tolerate. Because if it's different, even talking about, again, this prodromal population versus normal elderly who may or may not develop Alzheimer's, you're really talking about treating cognitively normal individuals with a treatment for something they may not develop. And that's, I think, somewhat similar to what you're discussing. I don't know that I can give you a clear how do we do that answer, but it's an issue that we're definitely aware of, and I'm trying to work with communities to figure out how to do that.
And Michelle had some.
Well, I don't have an answer for that, but I do have a caution, which is, if you look at the vaccine space over the last 20 years, you see the complexity of trying to do trials and then eventually treat patients without symptoms or patients without obvious clinical disease. It gets really, really complicated, and the tolerance for risk may be reasonable to deal with when you're working the clinical trial, but when you actually have a complication in an otherwise healthy person, it can shut down things very, very quickly. And we saw this in the gene therapy trials 10 or 15 years ago. So we want to make sure we don't shut down areas of research because we've exposed patients that are otherwise healthy too early as well.
Just say that I think it gets down to what I talked about going in steps, that if you want to cure people tomorrow and you jump in, you could get burnt. But if you can show safety data in a group that's more advanced and therefore the risk benefit is not as acute, once you have that, then I think they're much more able to think about going early. I think you have to stage it.
What other questions or comments do we have? If I could just make one last point.
You've got one in the back. If you want to raise your hand a little higher so the microphone can get
Please.
there.
This would be more of a statement. I don't know that anybody has the answer, but your example was clear cut with the patient that has 6 months to live versus the migraine. What about for epilepsy? One seizure could be the end of someone's life, or they could live, decades with it. So is it up to the people sitting at a table on a certain day to decide what the risk-benefit factor is for something that's that arbitrary?
Michelle?
There's not a clear-cut answer, but I will mention a trial that we're doing right now. We're actually in partnership with the Research Triangle Institute, RTI, to do a trial of patients' views on risk tolerance and obesity, which kind of is somewhat parallel to the example you gave. And we're asking them a series of very detailed questions around three hypothetical medical devices, including one which they're calling the reunion balloon, which would be a balloon that you swallowed that would let you lose 20 pounds, but you'd only keep it off for a month.
Or the wedding balloon.
Or the wedding balloon. Yeah, depending on where your pressure points are. But yeah, so getting people's idea of okay, what sort of risk would you accept for that sort of benefit, and then zero, right? I think that one patient in the qualitative part of the study said, "That's a cheeseburger. I wouldn't even notice that." That kind of thing. So getting creating like a really nuanced view of a range of patient perspectives is really, really important. And we're doing this in depth in this study, and this is a study that we worked very closely with NORD on in terms of helping design the questions and helping choose which area to begin with, and we're going to be doing that in more disease areas upcoming. But it's an expensive, slow approach, and that kind of survey data requires OMB approval if done by a federal agency, which slows it down even more. So it means that our ability to go out and in-depthly survey patients is severely limited, and that's a bit unfortunate.
And maybe one other perspective on your question about epilepsy would be that if you look at the new provisions of FDASIA that Andrea helped us understand a bit, you see more emphasis on communication with patient community and earlier on in the process, a point of emphasis that we're trying to express more and more frequently. And it ties in with what Andrea told us about trying to understand 20 disease groups over a 5-year period. So much of this involves educating the reviewer. There are 600 neurological diseases, and we have to educate the reviewer on all 600. If epilepsy is going to come before them, they should know more about epilepsy. So these programs are steps in the right direction, in my view, but we need to do more of it and earlier in the process. And I think our FDA colleagues would readily agree and are embracing steps in that direction. So.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.